The story begins with a violent explosion on a cliff, and as the dust begins to settle, a man approaches, striking downward with a powerful blow. The other man laughs, impressed, asking how it is that his opponent is still able to move despite such a severe injury. Before he added an elaboration that his mental fortitude matches his title of the Phantom Swordsman. He admits that the sword technique his opponent created is impressive, but with a push backward, he adds that the Phantom Swordsman won't be able to use internal energy in his current state. He pushed the injured man with more power before he spoke once more. It is miraculous enough that he is still able to move, and there's no need to continue fighting, as he plans to end it and put his opponent to sleep. Imbuing a purple aura into his blade, the man draws it back and swings forward, sending multiple sword arc made of inner energy of attacks at the Phantom Swordsman. While his opponent is busy deflecting them, the man rushes in, delivering a powerful kick to his gut, causing the Phantom Swordsman to fall to the ground. The man then stabs downward toward his head, but the Phantom Swordsman rolls to the side to avoid it. He quickly counters, delivering a kick that knocks the man's sword from his grasp, sending it flying through the air. The Phantom Swordsman grabs his own blade and thrusts forward, but the man dodges, though the blade still grazes his cheek. The Phantom Swordsman follows up with a left hook to the man's face, knocking him to the ground. The man, now lying on the floor, insists that he won't let his opponent win. He imbues inner energy into his hands and releases an aura wave, despite being unarmed. To his surprise, he finds that the Phantom Swordsman is no longer there, leaving him to wonder where he has gone. As he looks up, horror spreads across his face, just in time to see the Phantom Swordsman descending from the air. In a single swift motion, the Phantom Swordsman cuts him down the middle. The scene shifts to another man, sighing in relief. He asks the Phantom Swordsman if he has killed the old demon head, to which the Phantom Swordsman confirms. With the old demon head gone, the bloodbath, the Shangxi massacre, will finally come to an end. The man refers to the mysterious group known as the Black Knight Palace, who had swept through numerous smaller sects and clans in the last 3 days. He reflects on how the world was able to witness the alliance of 2 rival factions, the Orthodox and Unorthodox, because of this incident. The Phantom Swordsman's true name is revealed to be Dokgo Heon, and the other man recalls a promise they made to duel after creating their own sword techniques. Sadly, he admits that he will not be able to fulfill it. When asked if that is what he's thinking about in his final moments, the man responds affirmatively, laughing. He has dedicated his entire life to the sword and has fought countless martial artists, witnessing many techniques. Yet, none have been as difficult to deal with as the Phantom Swordsman's. His devotion to the sword surpasses all others, and because of that, he asks the Phantom Swordsman to look after his disciple in Mount Hua Sect. Dokgo Heon, surprised, asks if the man has lost his mind, especially since the disciple belongs to the Mount Hua Sect. He is asking why the best swordsman of the Unorthodox Faction would look after a disciple of the Orthodox Faction. The dying man hands him a beaded circlet, the plum blossom spirit beads, a relic of Mount Hua, and asks him to give it to the sect leader. Dokgo Heon wonders if the man is truly out of his mind, but soon realizes that this is the earnest wish of a dying man. The man laughs, saying that they are only sword friends, but he has always been grateful. Dokgo Heon agrees, noting that he will spend the rest of his life at Mount Hua, thanks to his friend. Before he can finish his sentence, the man's body explodes, turning into red mist, leaving only chunks of his remains behind. Dokgo Heon is left stunned, wondering what just happened. He turns, only to see a purple light as an inner energy flies toward him. Gritting his teeth, Dokgo Heon tightens his grip on his blade and asks who is responsible for this, returning a swing to deflect the attack. However, the aura wave is too powerful and destroys his counterattack effortlessly. In genuine surprise, Dokgo Heon watches as his opponent begins preparing 2 black-purple concentration of inner energy, 1 in each hand. The ensuing blast can only be described as epitome of a destruction. When the smoke clears, Dokgo Heon, now missing an arm and severely injured, sits on his knees, questioning how someone could be so powerful. As he approaches his own final moments, he wonders if this is the Night Palace Master, though he quickly dismisses the idea, knowing that the old demon head is still dead and his corpse remains intact. It seemed that the mysterious figure was either a hidden disciple or, perhaps, the true Night Palace Master, much stronger than the imposter he had killed. Heon, gazing at his severed arm, murmurs an apology, regretful that he never had the chance to bring his long friend's body back home. It seems both of them will die on this cliff, but with determination, Hyun slams his hand onto his knee, promising that, at the very least, he will keep his word. The other man watches in surprise as Hyun charges forward to fight, unarmed and undeterred. Hyun himself isn't sure if he will survive the fall from the cliff after losing his companion. But if there is any hope, he has to believe in it. Though he may be fleeing now, he will never forget his fallen friend. When they meet again, it will be for the final confrontation. But of course, that chance will never come. Just as Hyun runs, an attack cuts him directly in half. He turns in shock, realizing that the masked man launched the attack from a distance, his power much greater than Hyun had initially thought. The masked man laughs after landing the blow, prompting Hyun to retort that such laughter is disrespectful, especially in someone's final moments. As he begins to fall, his final words are an apology to his friend, admitting that he likely won't be able to keep the promise he made. The spirit beads on his hand start glowing brightly, and below, in the forest, the light is radiated. People say they can feel his pulse, marveling that the heavens have indeed helped him. Hyun, now regaining consciousness, is astonished. He opens his eyes and hears people calling him senior disciple. One of the men yells for an elder, who rushes to Hyun's side, calling him Mu Hwi, praising him for surviving. Hyun, confused, recognizes the elder as the Mount Hua Sect's elder, Baek-jin, but wonders why the man keeps calling him Mu Hwi. After all, Mu Hwi is the senior disciple of Mount Hua's second-generation disciples and his own friend, Hyun Jo's disciple. Hyun wonders if the elder has lost his mind. The elder tells him not to speak as his wounds haven't fully healed. Hyun begins to realize that he might be forced to live in Mount Hua after all. After some time, Dokgo Heon begins to leave, and the elder asks if he is going. Dokgo Heon acknowledges, almost responding rudely, but Baek-jin advises him not to push himself too hard, as he had been bedridden and unable to eat for the past week. Dokgo Heon agrees and steps outside, where the sights of a giant well and a grand temple greet him. He heads toward the garden area, splashing water onto his face, reflecting on the past week. Though only 7 days have passed, it feels as though years have passed to him. He has dreamt of an entire life, reliving the last 2 decades that Mu Hwi experienced. It is revealed that their sect had been attacked. One of their buildings explodes and soldiers are fighting valiantly, but the situation seems dire. Standing among the chaos is none other than the Black Knight Palace Master, or at least, the imposter he had seen earlier. As Dokgo Heon learns Mu Hwi's life, he hears Hyun Jo shouting at the masked man before charging in to confront him. Mu Hwi watches as a man raises a weapon to kill one of his fellow disciples, and without hesitation, he dashes forward to block the attack. However, he is struck across the chest, falling to the ground like a warrior from that attack. Dokgo Heon, seeing this, calls Mu Hwi a fool, asking why he would throw himself in harm's way when his body was so weak. The injury proves fatal, and Dokgo Heon realizes that the light from earlier must have come from the spirit beads. Now he wonders why it had to be him. Why Mu Hwi, and not Hyun Jo? Wondering whether that is fate. Sighing, Dokgo Heon acknowledges that, despite his reluctance, he cannot waste this second chance at life. He vows to find the masked man and exact his revenge, determined to become stronger than ever before. After all, he had nearly perished at the hands of the imposter, and if he hoped to defeat him, he would need to surpass his previous limits. Dokgo Heon walks up the steps to an empty training room, likely Hyun Jo's, and reflects on his late friend's final words. Hyun Jo had led their disciples bravely, urging them to protect their home without fear. As Dokgo Heon picks up a book from the wall, he makes a promise to fulfill Hyun Jo's last request and avenge his death, no matter the cost. The scene shifts to a discussion among the elders, who are deliberating whether they need to rebuild a total of 8 pavilions. Among them informs the sect leader that the damage has been worsened because they were unable to extinguish the last ambush's fire in time. The sect leader sighs, assuming that they lack the funds for such an extensive project due to prior damages. He turns to Baek-san, asking if that is the case. Baek-san confirms, adding that profits and visitors will be drastically reduced. He appears to be the one in charge of the sect's finances. The sect leader falls silent, concluding that large expenditures must be avoided, suggesting they should start with the most important pavilions. His name is Baekyu. He then turns to Baek-jin, asking how the disciples are recovering. Baek Jin responds that they are all recovering well, and even those in serious condition are improving. Baek Yu is relieved, but asks about Mu Hwi, expressing concern that the news of Hyun Jo's death must have been a great shock. Baek Jin reassures him that Mu Hwi has taken it better than expected. His wounds have healed significantly, and he was walking around outside yesterday. Baek San laughs, questioning if Mu Hwi is truly feeling that much better. Baek Yu agrees that it's good if Mu Hwi is taking it well, but advises Baek Jin to check on him occasionally, worried that Mu Hwi might be pretending to be fine. He hopes that Mu Hwi will be alright, as they all know what kind of person he is. Meanwhile, Dokgo Heon is inside the house, reading through martial arts manuals. As he reads, something catches his attention, triggering a memory of Hyun Jo asking him about the disciples. Hyun Jo had inquired what Dokgo Heon thought of them, to which Dokgo Heon had replied they were useless. Hyun Jo agreed, noting that the sect seemed to be regressing. He found it ironic that they clung to the belief that the plum blossom sword technique, which represented variability and illusions, was perfection. Hyun Jo was certain that Dokgo Heon understood the future consequences of a sect that failed to reflect and innovate. Dokgo Heon had pointed out that such stagnation could lead to their downfall. Hyun Jo acknowledged the truth of this, but emphasized that change could not be forced. Dokgo Heon, however, had insisted that if he were in Hyun Jo's position, he would try to push for change, asking if Hyun Jo had any other ideas. As the plum blossoms began to fall around them, Hyun Jo shared his thoughts. He believed that the only way forward was to show the disciples that the plum blossom sword technique was not the end, but rather a stepping stone to a higher realm. Dokgo Heon asked if this was why Hyun Jo had made the promise to create their own sword techniques and duel in the future. Hyun Jo explained that he had reached his current level by renovating various martial techniques, and he thought it might be possible for Dokgo Heon, given his title as the Phantom Swordsman and his standing as the best swordsman in his faction. Dokgo Heon, reflecting on his initial judgment of the Mount Hua Sect, admitted that he had once thought the problem lay in the sect's decline, unable to produce talent beyond Hyun Jo for the last century. However, he now realized how foolish he had been. He had focused on martial arts techniques like the six-fold combo circulation technique and the sword technique itself, seeing them as flawless. But he now understood that martial techniques grow in power over time as they are passed through the hands of others. This was the true strength of a sect, and Mount Hua had hit a wall because of its greatness. The sect's determination to break through that wall by showing the disciples a new realm was key. If Hyun Jo's wish was to demonstrate this determination and lead the disciples to a higher understanding, then the unfinished sword technique would be Dokgo Heon's to complete, as a way to honor their promise. This sword technique would need to reflect not just Mount Hua's form and movements, but its deeper intentions. To achieve this, Dokgo Heon realized he must align himself with the teachings of the sect and start from the basics. Only then could he complete Hyun Jo's sword technique. Sitting in a lotus position, Dokgo Heon begins cultivating his inner energy, letting out a slow exhale. He reflects on the need to let go of the martial arts teachings that Hyun Jo had imparted to him. Even if he tried, he could not deny that they were part of him, and he could not underestimate the basics. The autumn flower circulation technique, for instance, was stable and not inferior to the ghost arts. In his past life, Dokgo Heon had only sought efficiency and used unorthodox sword techniques. However, the techniques of the Mount Hua Sect were different, and he might learn something entirely new from them. This marked the end of his life as the Phantom Swordsman. From now on, Dokgo Heon would fully embrace his new identity, Mu Hwi. Some time later, a man is seen heading up the stairs toward Mu Hwi's abode. He seems curious about something, calling out to Mu Hwi, asking if he's inside. Mu Hwi, looking noticeably tired, hears the voice and opens the door, surprising the man. He recognizes him as Mu Cheol, who explains that he came to check on Mu Hwi, noting that it's been 3 days since he left the Harmony Medicine Palace, yet Mu Hwi hasn't been attending the morning training sessions. Mu Hwi, startled, asks if it's really been 3 days. Mu Cheol stands in silence, and Mu Hwi reflects on the fact that he hadn't eaten properly for 7 days, which brings to mind his previous experience being trapped in the Blood Tempest sect's inescapable net technique. He says he lost track of time then as well. With that, he suggests they head to the training hall. Mu Cheol agrees, though it's clear he's thinking about something else, commenting that Mu Hwi seems different. Mu Hwi, undeterred, thinks that a drink would be nice, heading toward the training area. As they approach, they hear a man yelling out skill names and demonstrating them to a group of disciples. Mu Hwi watches as the disciples follow the instructor's commands, though they appear to be struggling. One disciple, Mu Ryan, is told to raise his arm higher. He complies, but Mu Hwi observes that they're all performing terribly. Their feet move when they shouldn't, their balance is off, and they're unable to generate any real power in their strikes. Their posture is also completely wrong, and overall, they lack the basic skills. Mu Hwi acknowledges that the instructor, Mujin, isn't bad and at least seems to know what he's doing. He's the only one who's doing his job correctly. Mu Hwi reflects that Mujin is more like the senior disciple of the second generation, though he wonders why Mujin is the one leading the training rather than a senior disciple. It seems the previous owner of his body had a shy personality and lacked martial arts and leadership skills, but Mujin is different. He has the ability to lead, a calm demeanor, and has shown great potential since a young age. Mu Hwi thinks it's natural that more disciples listen to Mujin. Talented individuals with the right skills should be given opportunities, and Mujin's personality makes him a more natural fit for the role of senior disciple, at least for now. Mujin finishes the training session, telling the disciples to leave, noting that they all seem particularly beaten today. As they exit, one of them asks Mu Hwi if he's feeling all right. Mu Hwi replies that he's fine, but another disciple notices that something feels different about him. Mujin then steps down, apologizing for not properly greeting Mu Hwi earlier due to the training. Mu Hwi tells him it's fine, acknowledging that it must be difficult to handle the responsibilities that should have been his. He then wonders if he's not going to come down the stairs, which might be seen as rude. Mujin, however, just expresses gratitude that Mu Hwi is letting him take the lead. Mu Hwi then declares that from now on, he'll be taking over the responsibilities. Mujin looks irritated, and one of the disciples asks if she heard correctly. The others seem unsure, but Mu Chiol thinks to himself, remarking that he's not just being sensitive. Something has definitely changed about Mu Hwi. Mujin, frustrated, responds that he had given Mujin the task because he didn't have confidence that he could carry it out properly. Mu Hwi, smiling knowingly, thinks that he had suspected this all along. He then assumes that Mujin's ultimate goal is to become the head disciple. It is explained that the head disciple's role is one that carries the potential to succeed the sect leader. With the loss of many first-generation disciples due to the Shangxi massacre, the remaining elders are busy with the reconstruction of the sect. It would be far more efficient to guide the second-generation disciples who represent the future of the sect rather than attempting to change the elders or first-generation disciples. Mu Hwi also understands that the head disciple is the only one, aside from the sect leader, who can learn the purple aura circulation technique, one of the top 10 techniques for internal energy circulation. To surpass his previous self, Mu Hwi needs to master this technique, so he has no choice but to take on the role of head disciple. While it may be shocking, this is the path he must take. Mujin, skeptical, asks if Mu Hwi truly believes he is right in this decision. He questions what Mu Hwi did the night the Black Knight Palace invaded the sect. Mu Chiol interrupts, shouting Mujin's name as Mujin reminds him that the elders had told him to stay put, but Mu Hwi hadn't listened, and the consequences of that night followed. Mu Hwi smiles as Mujin continues questioning him, asking if he saved any of the elders or others during the invasion, or if he killed anyone from the Black Knight Palace. Mu Hwi shakes his head, admitting that he didn't save anyone. He only managed to burden them in the end. Mujin's expression shifts, realizing what Mu Hwi is getting at. He then states that because of Mu Hwi's actions, several disciples followed suit, and if the first-generation disciples hadn't risked their lives to protect everyone, many of them wouldn't be here now. Mu Hwi agrees, acknowledging that Mujin is right, but Mujin seems annoyed that he's simply accepting the blame without further explanation. Mu Hwi then declares that, as the senior disciple, he intends to take responsibility for everything moving forward. Mujin, not entirely convinced, asks how they are supposed to trust him now. Mu Hwi, already heading up the stairs, smirks and replies that Mujin is misunderstanding something. When Mujin asks what he means, Mu Hwi turns and, glaring at him, asks since when did he need to look up to him. He then asks if it sounds like he's trying to convince Mujin, or if he has to ask for permission in the choices he makes. Mu Hwi isn't trying to convince anyone. He's simply notifying them of his decisions. Mujin, clearly surprised, was shaken by the presence of the man in front of him, wondering what kind of person this was. This was definitely not the same senior disciple he knew, and it sent a chill through him. Mu Hwi, unfazed, tells him that he'll be taking over the morning training starting tomorrow. If Mujin has any complaints, he should come to see him after the training, but that he shouldn't get too upset about it. Mu Jin is still taken aback, muttering that Mu Hwi seems like a completely different person. Mu Hwi, still calm, says that people often change when they come back from the brink of death, and it's safe to assume that's what's happened to him. Meanwhile, the other disciples are gossiping about the change in Mu Hwi. They overhear Mu Jin's frustration and wonder if Mu Hwi really plans to take over the training sessions. Some disciples begin discussing it amongst themselves, with one saying that they heard the same thing. Another adds that Mu Jin was really mad at first but calmed down, though his face looked odd. One disciple expresses concern, mentioning that while Mu Jin might be trying to back down out of kindness, he's still worried, especially knowing the senior disciple's skill level. That night, a group of disciples heads over to Mu Hwi's house, knocking on the door. When Mu Hwi answers, they ask if they can talk. He responds with curiosity, noting that if they want to talk away from the others, he's eager to hear what they have to say. He tightens his grip on his wooden sword, ready for whatever may come. One of the disciples is surprised to see Mu Hwi holding the wooden sword, as it's so unlike him. Mu-san speaks up, saying that he'll get straight to the point. They want him to take back what he said, explaining that Mu Jin only backed off from the discussion because he wanted to help preserve Mu Hwi's image. Mu Hwi finds this interesting and asks if Mu Jin sent them. They respond that they came of their own volition. Mu Hwi nods, still intrigued, but he makes it clear that they have no say in his decisions, and he'll pretend he didn't hear what they said. He suggests they leave. Mu-san calls out to him, asking him to consider their perspective. He tells Mu Hwi that it isn't about disliking him. They just want to be taught by someone who is actually skilled. They point out that, right now, Mu Hwi's skills are subpar, and this is him being greedy, nothing more. Mu Hwi sighs, acknowledging that Mount Hua's hierarchy seems to have degraded. He understands their doubt about his skills, so he'll prove himself to them. He tells them to grab their swords. The disciples ask if he's serious, to which Mu Hwi replies that he is. He knows how they feel, but if they want to see his skills, they'll have to face him. Mu-san pulls out his blade, declaring that he asked for this, and charges in, warning Mu Hwi not to regret it. Mu Hwi immediately disarms him, slapping his hand, and then striking him in the chest with the hilt of his wooden sword. The force causes Mu-san to fall to his knees, coughing. Mu Hwi glares at the others, and Mu Ho tries to join in, but Mu Hwi smacks him in the head with the sword, causing him to fall as well. Mu-san, still confused, tells Mu Hwi that he lost, and Mu Hwi agrees, adding that now it's time for them to learn a lesson. Mu Ho's leg twitches as Mu Hwi asks if they're satisfied with the lesson. The disciples confirm, and Mu Hwi reminds them of what he said would happen if anyone tried to gang up on him. They would beat them as well. They acknowledge that, and Mu Hwi asks if they still think he's weaker than Mu Jin. They quickly respond that he's much stronger than him, and when he presses them, they admit that Mu Hwi is definitely stronger than the other disciples as well. Mu Hwi looked at the disciples, noticing that they seemed to have learned their lesson. He decided to forget about what had happened, acknowledging that everyone made mistakes. With morning training approaching, he told them to go get some rest. They thanked him for his mercy and left, with Mu Ho being carried away. Mu Hwi watched them leave and then called out, asking someone how long they planned to stay hidden. He told them to come out, and it was none other than Mu Chiol, who seemed surprised and asked how Mu Hwi knew he was there. Mu Hwi found it amusing that Mu Chiol had tried to hide, given how large he was, and asked him what he wanted. Mu Chiol explained that he had just seen Mu-san and Mu Ho head in this direction. Mu Hwi was curious and asked who they were, to which Mu Chiol replied that he had followed them just in case, not expecting Mu Hwi to win against them. He added that he didn't think he could defeat them. Mu Chiol then asked if Mu Hwi had been hiding his true skills all this time. Mu Hwi reflected on his observations of the second-generation disciples, noting two types: those who kept their distance while still respecting him, and those who secretly looked down on him. Mu Chiol didn't belong to either group, as he had often helped Mu Hwi, despite his blunt and indifferent personality. Mu Hwi thought it had to be because Mu Chiol was worried about him. When he was younger, Mu Hwi hadn't understood this, but now he realized that Mu Chiol's actions were driven by concern. Mu Chiol had been worried that Mu Hwi might be gravely injured by Mu-san and Mu Ho, which was why he had followed them to ensure he would be all right. Mu Hwi decided to make an excuse and said that he wasn't hiding his skills, but had simply reached a new realm of understanding. Mu Chiol, seemingly convinced, asked what he meant. Mu Hwi replied that he would explain it during the morning training and suggested Mu Chiol return for now, since it was still a bit early. Mu Chiol agreed and watched Mu Hwi head back into his house. As Mu Chiol walked away, he thought about what Mu Hwi had said, realizing that the move Mu Hwi had used was the six-fold combo sword technique, a beginner-level technique. However, it had been executed in a way he had never seen before, with such beauty and precision that it made him wonder what Mu Hwi had truly learned. Mu Chiol, who had always believed Mu Hwi was weak, found himself amazed at how much Mu Hwi had changed. For the first time, he felt a genuine excitement about morning training. Mu Hwi, reflecting on the excuse he had made up on the spot, wondered how he was going to explain himself further. Meanwhile, Mu Ryan asked Mu San and Mu Ho if they really had gotten beaten so easily. They both affirmed, noting that Mu Hwi wasn't the same senior disciple they once knew. He had become a different person. Mu San advised caution, explaining that they couldn't act rashly. Mu Ho, still in disbelief, hoped that Mu Hwi wouldn't turn against them. Mu Ryan dismissed their concerns, saying they were just talking nonsense, and suggested they prepare for morning training. Mu San, carrying Mu Ho once again, reminded them that they would likely face the consequences if they disrespected the senior disciple. As they walked by, Mu Jin, curious about their condition, asked Mu Ryan if something had happened since they both looked terrible and were limping. Mu Ryan downplayed it, saying it was just about Mu Hwi leading the morning training. After a brief explanation, Mu Jin expressed that he understood, but he would have to scold them later. Mu Ryan was puzzled, asking why, and Mu Jin explained that, while he understood that the senior disciple was standing up for himself, it wouldn't be beneficial to act behind his back. He was ashamed of their actions. Mu Ryan, surprised that Mu Jin wasn't taking it well, explained that they were just worried about him. Mu Jin, however, assured him that he understood their concern and would handle it himself. He told them not to worry about it. As they approached the training grounds, Mu Jin's thoughts wandered. He couldn't understand how someone could change so much overnight. He speculated that Mu Hwi had been hiding his skills, but it was still hard to believe that he could have injured Mu San and Mu Ho. Perhaps Mu Chiol had helped him, but Mu Jin knew that the truth would soon be revealed. He would be able to tell if Mu Hwi was bluffing or not by how he led the training. Mu Hwi, now in front of the disciples, began the morning session. He observed that they were all weak and explained that while there were many reasons someone could be strong, there was only one reason for weakness: a lack of the basics. Therefore, starting from that moment, they would focus exclusively on the six-fold combo sword technique during their morning training. The disciples were all taken aback as Mu Hwi spoke, assuring them that he knew they were eager to quickly move past the basics and advance to higher-level techniques. Before he could continue, Mu Ryan interrupted, questioning what was wrong with that. Mu Hwi, stunned by the interruption, couldn't believe it, and even Mu Chiol and Mu Jin turned around in confusion. Mu Ryan persisted, asking what the problem was with wanting to learn faster, and took it upon himself to suggest that if the others couldn't manage, he would. Mu San, realizing how foolish this was, shook his head. Mu Ryan laughed, dismissing the sect's renown as a joke, calling it a mess. Mu Hwi responded, stating that if Mu Ryan had any complaints, he should come up and address him himself. One of the female disciples was surprised, and so was Mu Jin, who began to wonder what the hell Mu Ryan was thinking as he made his way toward Mu Hwi. Mu Ryan smirked, explaining that he understood Mu Hwi's point, but he wasn't sure if it was a good idea to leave the training in his hands, especially if mastering the six-fold combo sword technique was as important as Mu Hwi had claimed. Mu Hwi cut him off, unimpressed, pointing out that Mu Ryan's martial arts were lacking. However, since no one else was willing to step up, he would be the one to prove himself. He asked if that was what Mu Ryan was trying to get at. Mu Ryan was silent for a moment before Mu Hwi added that he hadn't expected everyone to accept him from the start. He then ordered the disciples to pay attention. From now on, he would not take a single step and would use only the six-fold combo sword technique to block Mu Ryan's attacks. If Mu Ryan's wooden sword touched him, or if he took a step back, Mu Ryan would win. And if Mu Ryan succeeded, Mu Hwi would take back his statement about teaching the six-fold combo sword technique and leading the morning training. He locked eyes with Mu Jin as he spoke. Mu Ryan laughed, mocking Mu Hwi's confidence, asking if Mu Hwi thought his victory over Mu San meant something. Mu Hwi didn't respond directly, instead saying that he wasn't sure what Mu Ryan meant, though it did seem like Mu San and Mu Ho had sustained some serious injuries. Mu Ryan jokingly added that Mu Hwi shouldn't hate him too much if he ended up losing in front of all the disciples. Mu Hwi, serious, replied that he hoped Mu Ryan wouldn't cross that line. With that, Mu Ryan charged, aiming to strike. Mu Hwi raised his sword, easily blocking the first attack. Mu Ryan followed with a swift attack from the side, which Mu Hwi blocked in turn. Mu Ryan then attempted a feint, but it was no more successful. Every move Mu Ryan made was swiftly blocked by Mu Hwi, leaving the other disciples in stunned silence. As Mu Ryan became more desperate, he began thrusting forward rapidly, trying to land a hit. One of the female disciples recognized the movement as the concentrated wind sword, a technique known for its speed. Mu Chiol explained that it was the technique Mu Ryan excelled at, and he had even become faster since the last time Mu Chiol saw him use it. Despite the rapid flurry of strikes, Mu Hwi blocked every single one with ease. Mu Ryan was clearly frustrated, and Mu Hwi commented that he needed to use more strength in his shoulders when facing him, as he was stronger than the other second-generation disciples. However, Mu Hwi also implied that Mu Ryan's skills were still lacking. Mu Ryan, feeling the pressure, began to worry about how to proceed, as he could feel everyone's eyes on him. The disciples murmured among themselves, impressed by Mu Hwi's performance. They couldn't believe how much stronger he was than they had initially thought. They noted that his feet had not moved an inch, and his balance was impeccable, making it seem like he had become a different person. Mu Jin, struggling to make sense of what was happening, was in disbelief, unable to comprehend what he was witnessing. Mu Ryan, meanwhile, began to think about what he could do next, realizing that he couldn't recover from this. He had proven the senior disciples' martial arts skills, but not in the way he had hoped. He wondered how Mu Hwi had improved so much. Mu Hwi, reading his thoughts, explained that it wasn't about being strong. A sword should be swung with the whole body, and the most important part of swinging a sword was using your feet. If one overlooked the importance of the feet, focusing only on the swing, the sword would be useless. Mu Ryan, still trying to grasp it all, thought about what Mu Hwi had said. He was beginning to realize that Mu Hwi was right, but Mu Hwi, sensing his hesitation, pressed on. He said that Mu Ryan probably didn't fully understand, but deep down Mu Ryan was starting to get it. Mu Hwi then raised his sword into the air, preparing to demonstrate what it truly meant to swing a sword with the entire body. Mu Ryan, confused, protested, but before he could say anything, Mu Hwi moved with lightning speed and smacked him with the sword. On the ground, Mu Jin could hardly believe what had just happened, witnessing the senior disciple had easily subdued Mu Ryan. Mu Hwi turned to Mu San and Mu Ho, telling them to come forward and bring Mu Ryan to the Harmony Medicine Palace. They nodded and began running, taking Mu Ryan away. Mu Hwi looked around at the disciples, asking what they were doing. He told them that they needed to raise their swords. If they didn't, he would take it as a complaint about his method, and they could come up and voice their objections at any time. Seeing that no one had any complaints, they all got into their stances. Mu Hwi, pleased, declared that it was time to officially begin the morning training. As he did, he noticed that Mu Ryan's blood was still on his face. The morning training session spent on Mu Hwi instructing the disciples. The scene then shifted to a flashback where Hyun asked Hyun Jo about his disciple, Mu Hwi. Hyun was perplexed, calling Mu Hwi the worst of them all and questioning if he possessed any hidden talent that Hyun had failed to see. He wondered why Hyun Jo had chosen Mu Hwi as his disciple. Hyun Jo, acknowledging that Mu Hwi was indeed an ordinary kid, explained that he had never seen him give up on anything in his life. Hyun then asked if Hyun Jo had chosen Mu Hwi purely because of his determination. Hyun Jo agreed, but added that the talented disciples had reached enlightenment on their own. However, to create a martial master out of an ordinary person was the duty of a mentor in the essence of martial arts. The flashback ended, and Mu Hwi reflected on Hyun Jo's words. He admitted that, ideally, he would have picked out only the most talented disciples to train. However, he was no longer the Phantom Swordsman. He was the senior disciple, responsible for leading the second-generation disciples of the Mount Hua Sect. He realized that, to fulfill his duty, he had to stick with them until the very end. Mu Hwi noted that though he had never properly taught the disciples before, he found that having disciples was far more annoying than he had anticipated. He sighed, joking that if they met again after his death, they would have to buy him a really good drink. Mu Hwi glanced at Mu Jin, asking if he was already tired, urging him to put more strength into his movements. As Mu Hwi trained the others, his mind wandered to one of his disciples, wondering how he was doing. He knew he had always focused on bettering himself and never teaching others. He couldn't help but wonder if his disciple was even eating properly, but at least he was confident that his disciple wasn't losing any fights. It would be nice to see him again someday. The scene shifted to Mu Hwi, who had a bandage on his head and was now instructed by Mu Hwi to properly train their lower bodies using logs as weights. Although it was a rough path that required starting from scratch, Mu Hwi was confident that, through this trial, the plum flower would blossom. Its scent strong and deep, impossible for anyone to replicate. He too had a long way to go, but his first step in changing the sect was to raise his martial realm. One of the most important aspects of this was sharpening his senses. As the sharper his senses became, the easier it would be to notice small changes in his surroundings, which would naturally improve his martial arts training. Though he hadn't felt much when he first opened his eyes, he could now sense that someone had been watching him. It didn't feel threatening, more like someone was observing him out of curiosity. While he couldn't pinpoint who it was just yet, he was certain that, soon enough, he would be able to tell who they were and where they were. Mu Hwi continued walking through the Crimson Forest, thinking about his path forward, and made his way to a pavilion. He entered the building, where a man named Hyun Gak greeted him, wondering who had come in. Upon seeing Mu Hwi, Hyun Gak asked what he needed. Mu Hwi respectfully greeted Hyun Gak and explained that he had hoped to study the secret techniques. Hyun Gak found this curious, but warned him that his injuries couldn't have fully healed, so he shouldn't overexert himself. Mu Hwi agreed, acknowledging his caution. Hyun Gak then mentioned that he had heard Mu Hwi's disciple had been rather rude to him. Mu Hwi paused, wondering who Hyun Gak was referring to. After thinking for a moment, Mu Hwi recalled that he had beaten 3 different people recently, but it didn't matter who it was. Hyun Gak apologized, saying it seemed like Mu-san had done something to deserve the beating. He also added that, in his time, Mu-san would have faced even harsher consequences, and he was sorry he hadn't taught him better. Mu Hwi reassured Hyun Gak, saying it wasn't a big deal. He had just done what he was supposed to as the senior disciple, and Hyun Gak didn't need to worry about it. Hyun Gak was confused, asking if Mu Hwi had just referred to himself as the senior disciple. He was taken aback and wondered aloud if Mu Hwi's eyes had always been as sharp as they were now. Mu Hwi wondered why Hyun Gak was staring at him so intently, questioning whether he had changed his mind about being upset over the way he had beaten his disciple. Hyun Gak, however, simply remarked that Mu Hwi's eyes were full of determination, noting that it was good to see him taking his role as senior disciple seriously and looking after his martial brothers. He assured Mu Hwi that he didn't mean to keep him there, and that Mu Hwi was free to go on his way. Hyun Gak then began thinking to himself, reflecting on how Mu Hwi had lost his master and been left alone, but had managed to pull himself together. Hyun Gak felt proud to see Mu Hwi picking himself up again, filled with determination. He hoped that Hyun Jo could see it from wherever he was. Meanwhile, Mu Hwi gathered several scrolls and books, placing them on a table to begin reading. As he flipped through each one, he contemplated what the first step in changing the sect should be. The first step, he decided, was to raise his own martial realm. A question lingered: the definition of martial realm. Some might assume it refers to the strength of one's martial arts, but Mu Hwi explained that this was incorrect. Life and death in the martial world were not determined solely by the strength of one's techniques. No one would fight recklessly when the stakes were life and death. What truly mattered was the ability to utilize the martial arts one had learned, combined with quick, precise judgment and the physical capabilities to back it up. For this reason, a martial realm wasn't just about martial arts. It was the mastery of those arts, along with the wisdom and experience to go with them. That enlightenment came through endless contemplation and reflection. This was the definition of a martial realm that he had created when he was Hyun, the Phantom Swordsman, and the best swordsman of the Unorthodox Faction. It was a truth he had reached after years of training, contemplation, and learning all kinds of secret techniques. The first step in raising his martial realm, Mu Hwi concluded, was to understand his martial arts fully. However, he acknowledged that he still didn't truly know what the martial arts of Mount Hua were. But he wasn't going to remain ignorant forever. At this point, there were things he was not yet allowed to read. Books forbidden to disciples to prevent those who were too greedy or curious from foolishly attempting to learn higher-level techniques and ruining their key paths. All sects restricted access to their secret techniques, and Mount Hua was no exception. Hyun Jo had once said that Mount Hua was more lenient compared to others, but still, it was a renowned sect with a systematic approach to martial arts, and their techniques were not difficult to understand. Mu Hwi had already learned the basics, starting with the six-fold combo sword technique, the most fundamental technique. After that, he had mastered 3 more techniques: the concentrated wind sword, the falling plum blossom sword, and the thousand-cent sword. Once one learned these 3 techniques, they would gain access to the plum blossom sword secrets, which were essential for becoming the best martial artist in Mount Hua Sect. Only by mastering the plum blossom sword techniques could one use the sect's signature sword techniques: the 7 deadly plum blossom sword, the 3-edged plum blossom sword, and the lucid plum blossom sword. These skills were the foundation of Mount Hua's reputation as one of the 3 most renowned swordsmanship sections. It was said that the best swordsman of Mount Hua had mastered more than one of the 3 plum blossom swords. Mu Hwi reflected that the 6-fold combo sword technique was the root, the 3 techniques that followed were the trunk, and the sword's secrets after that were the branches. Finally, the 3 plum blossom swords were the flowers. A martial artist who delved deep into the sword techniques of Mount Hua became part of the plum blossom tree, representing the mastery and strength of the sect. At his current level, Mu Hwi had only reached the trunk. While he was eager to study the branches and beyond, he needed to acquire the plum blossom sword to do so. This sword was given only to those who had proven their martial mastery, and it was a symbol of the sect's highest honor. Mu Hwi knew he needed to obtain it as soon as possible. Just then, he heard someone approaching. Baekyu, the sect leader, asked if Mu Hwi truly wished to learn the plum blossom sword secrets. Mu Hwi immediately greeted Baekyu, who had come to check on him, as it had been a while since anyone had been in the room so late. Baekyu asked if he was allowed to sit with him. Mu Hwi, politely allowed, realized that the candles had been lit for him, presumably by Hyun Jo. Baekyu, noting Mu Hwi's focus, asked if he had really read all the materials before him. Mu Hwi confirmed that he had. Baekyu, now aware that Mu Hwi had been leading the 2nd-generation disciples in the morning training, mentioned that he had heard Mu Hwi was focusing on the 6-fold combo sword technique again. Mu Hwi looked at Baekyu and confirmed that everything he had said was correct. Baekyu, still curious, asked why Mu Hwi had chosen the 6-fold combo sword technique specifically. Mu Hwi, sensing Baekyu's probing, wondered what exactly he was trying to get at. Baekyu inwardly thinking that when Mu Hwi had first spoken to him before, he had always hesitated to answer him, even to simple questions. Now, Mu Hwi was doing things he hadn't done before, and he guessed that these were the kinds of things Baekyu was thinking about. He assumed Baekyu just wanted to check on him, to see if he was truly all right or if he was merely pretending to be fine and overexerting himself in the process. He figured that Baekyu was trying to gauge his well-being, wanting to give the answer he expected. Mu Hwi, in response, stated that the foundation of the sect was the 6-fold combo sword technique. Baekyu, acknowledging this, agreed. But Mu Hwi continued, explaining that while the foundation was sound, the 2nd-generation disciples had started off on the wrong foot. However, it was kinder to say that they might as well have never started at all. Baekyu, surprised by the bluntness of Mu Hwi's words, was taken aback. Mu Hwi thought that this was likely a good answer. After all, the sect leader himself knew how bad the 2nd-generation disciples were. By thinking these thoughts, Mu Hwi figured that just the fact they were in agreement on the matter would reassure Baekyu. Baekyu, however, was still in disbelief. He thought to himself that Mu Hwi's state was much worse than he had imagined. He appeared to be truly broken. Baekyu shook his head, realizing that Mu Hwi's situation might be more severe than anyone had anticipated. Baekyu silently pondered the child before him, trying to reconcile this figure with the Mu Hwi he once knew. That boy had been innocent, incapable of speaking ill of others, yet now he seemed like someone entirely different. The thoughts settled heavily in his mind. Something had changed him. Perhaps the Black Knight Palace's invasion, the weight of being the sole survivor, or the lingering guilt over the deaths of his master, the elders, and the 1st-generation disciples. Whatever the cause, Baekyu knew one thing with certainty. He needed to make Mu Hwi understand that none of it had been his fault. Mu Hwi continued, as though reading Baekyu's thoughts. All 2nd-generation disciples knew that the 6-fold combo sword technique was well within their grasp, something they had learned early on at the Mount Hua Sect. But despite their years of practice, their skill with the technique had deteriorated, a result of years spent training without focus. Baekyu listened closely as Mu Hwi elaborated. The martial arts of different sects and clans in the Jianghu were shaped by their distinct ideologies. These philosophies were embedded in their martial arts, making them more than just techniques. Mu Hwi went on to explain how each sect's martial school expressed its ideology. He mentioned Wudong's Taiji Fist, Diansong's Sun-Shattering Sword, and Qingqing's Azure Cloud Crimson Dawn Slash, all as examples of how martial arts techniques were a direct reflection of the ideologies of the sects. As Mu Hwi spoke, he considered his words carefully. To truly master a martial school's technique was not merely to practice the physical moves, but to understand and internalize the ideology behind them. It wasn't about perfecting a form. It was about embodying the philosophy the martial school represented. Mu Hwi's calm, precise explanation reminded Baekgyu of Hyun Jo. Despite Mu Hwi's apparent detachment, Baekgyu couldn't shake the feeling that his words were steeped in a depth and conviction reminiscent of his former disciple. Mu Hwi then concluded that the second-generation disciples had become overly focused on perfecting the plum flower, an ideal that distracted them from the true purpose of martial training. He explained that it wasn't about forcing the plum flower to bloom, but letting it happen naturally through the process of training and understanding the ideology behind their martial arts. Baekgyu nodded in agreement, impressed by the depth of Mu Hwi's understanding. The blossoming of the plum flower would come naturally through focused training, not through artificial attempts to make it happen. Mu Hwi then shared his plans to continue guiding the disciples in their training with the six-fold combo sword technique. However, Baekgyu shifted his question, making it clear he wasn't asking about the disciples. He wanted to know about Mu Hwi's path, the one he intended to follow for himself. Mu Hwi paused before answering, thinking carefully. He admitted that while he had great respect for the Mount Hua Sect's martial arts, there were aspects that he found lacking, especially from the perspective of someone who had always prioritized efficiency for survival. His thoughts wandered further. If his own path no longer aligned with Mount Hua's principles, it meant stepping beyond the sect's will, a thought that settled uneasily within him. But despite his internal conflict, Mu Hwi offered an answer that would satisfy Baekgyu's concerns. He intended to fulfill his master's wishes, to walk the same path his master had, and surpass him. That was the duty of a disciple, after all. However, deep down, Mu Hwi knew he wanted the freedom to do as he pleased, even if it meant giving Baekgyu an answer he was expected to hear. Baekgyu's realization struck him. It wasn't Mu Hwi's talent that reminded him of Hyun Jo. It was his intent to carry on Hyun Jo's will. The road ahead would be difficult. Creating new techniques was no small task, but there was something about Mu Hwi's resolve that intrigued him. Baekgyu's pride in Mu Hwi swelled, and he laughed heartily, expressing his happiness at seeing his growth. He was sure that Hyun Jo, wherever he was, would be proud as well. Mu Hwi simply acknowledged the praise, quietly thanking him. Baekgyu smiled contentedly as he thought back to the plum blossoms that had bloomed amidst the snow. Despite their delicate nature, the plum flowers had endured the harshest cold to bloom more intensely than ever. He thought of the ones he had failed to protect on Mount Hua. He should have been the one to fall, not them. Even though the plum flowers had fallen, a small bud remained beside them. His thoughts deepened further. His duty now was to nurture that bud and help it bloom. He gazed out the window, watching the moonlight illuminate the night, his resolve firming with every passing moment. He turned back to Mu Hwi. There were many flowers on Mount Hua, not just the plum flowers, Baekgyu remarked. Mu Hwi, curious, asked why the plum flowers had been chosen. Baekgyu smiled faintly, encouraging him to think about it. There were lessons to be learned, and Mu Hwi would understand in time. Baekgyu then realized the conversation had gone on long enough. He stood, apologizing for keeping Mu Hwi so long. As he made his way, he remembered something important. He turned to Mu Hwi, mentioning that there was something he had meant to tell him before he left. Baekgyu, reflecting on his own experience, expressed that though he, too, had lost his master, he couldn't claim to fully understand the depth of Mu Hwi's sadness. He acknowledged that everyone experiences emotions differently. He continued, explaining that life and death were one, an inevitable cycle where the end of something marked the beginning of something new. It was a natural flow of things. Instead of viewing Hyun Jo's death as an ending, Baekgyu advised Mu Hwi to see it as a new beginning and to think of his actions as a way of celebrating Hyun Jo's life. This shift in perspective, he believed, could help ease the grief. He was sure Hyun Jo would have wanted Mu Hwi to think this way. Mu Hwi reflected on the idea of celebrating his master's life. It didn't sound bad at all. He thanked Baekgyu for his wisdom, genuinely appreciating the advice. The wisdom reminded Mu Hwi of a past memory with his senior when he was Dokgo Heon. The senior had once commented on his fragility and how he had been young and impetuous then. Heon had been blunt in his response, asking if the senior wanted to die. He had called Heon arrogant and rash, but had added that those very qualities were perfect for training the body. The senior had then proposed a new way to train, something Hyun hadn't forgotten. Now Mu Hwi was using that very training method. Tying 3 massive logs together, he lifted them using his legs, holding onto a tree branch as he lifted his leg high to train his lower body. The less trained the body, the more effective this method was. Mu Hwi thought back to the eccentric old man, the Iron Mountain Fist King. The training method was certainly a brute force approach, but it worked. He hadn't expected that connection to come in handy like this. As Mu Hwi lost himself in thought, a female disciple approached him, calling out to him. It wasn't the time to be training, she said. Mu Hwi was briefly confused, unsure of what she meant. Brimming with excitements, she explained that the sect leader had ordered him to make a trip down the mountain. The morning had been spent discussing the concerns surrounding the third-generation disciples, and it was already late, so they had to prepare immediately. One of the elders spoke up, noting that they should have taken in third-generation disciples by now, but the Shanxi massacre had delayed their efforts. Baekyu added that they should also consider bringing in disciples from the outer sects, so others would know they were still doing well despite the setbacks. One elder agreed, and Baekyu confirmed the suggestion, seeing the need to reassure everyone. Baekjin raised a question about sending someone to check on the Shanxi outer sect, knowing that an unorthodox alliance or some other evil organization might be eyeing the power vacuum left behind. Baekyu agreed that this couldn't be ignored any longer. He considered how martial halls set up outside the main sect would attract new disciples eager to learn Mount Hua's martial arts. The massacre had weakened their forces, and the Shanxi outer sect had taken the hardest hit. As they deliberated on who to send, one elder raised a concern about who would go. Baekyu, however, suggested sending a second-generation disciple to give them a real taste of the Jianghu. The elders were hesitant, worried about how unstable the outside world still was. Baekyu suggested sending a few of the most talented disciples, and the idea quickly turned to the 3 flowers. Baekjin sought clarification, asking if Baekyu meant the 3 best disciples. Baekyu then proposed sending Mu Hwi as well, certain that Mu Hwi would have no problem dealing with the outside world. At first, Baekjin agreed, but then, in surprise, realized that the sect leader had proposed Mu Hwi for the task. One elder expressed concern about sending Mu Hwi, especially since he had changed a lot in the past month. Baekyu responded calmly, assuring them with a weary yet calming smile that Mu Hwi would be fine. Thus, Mu Hwi was sent out to see the outside world, and the scene shifted to Pasang City. Mu Hwi led 3 other disciples in accordance with the sect leader's orders. The town was small and unremarkable, with little to draw attention except for a simple establishment that sold drinks. Mu Hwi couldn't help but think to himself about how mundane the place seemed. However, Mu Hua, his fellow disciple, was completely distracted by the sight of a braised chicken, mesmerized by how delicious it looked. She excitedly asked her senior to look at it. Mu Jin, ever the voice of reason, reminded her that they were wearing the Mount Hua Sect's uniform and needed to behave accordingly. Mu Hua acknowledged him, but her attention quickly shifted to the scent of lamb meat a few steps away. Mu Jin had to call her out again. Mu Hua, still distracted by the smell of the food, insisted that they look at it, her hunger apparent. Mu Hwi noticed her distraction, but before he could comment, Mu Hua bumped into a thug on the street. Surprised, Mu Hua turned to face the man she had bumped into. The thug stared back at her, and the 4 disciples stood there awkwardly, with Mu Hua still startled by the encounter. Mu Jin immediately urged her to apologize, but before he could finish his words, Mu Hwi raised a hand to stop him. The thug, sizing them up, asked if they were second-generation disciples of the Mount Hua Sect. He remarked that it must have been their first time in the Jianghu and wondered if Mount Hua Sect didn't know how to ask for forgiveness. Mu Hua, still confused, wondered aloud about the thug's words. He went on to say that she should be the one to apologize as she had bumped into him first. The thugs pressed the issue, making it clear they believed Mu Hua was at fault. Mu Hwi, assessing the situation, realized the thugs must be from some criminal organization, given their appearance. He thought that they had likely taken advantage of the power vacuum left by the Shanxi outer sect. Despite the setback from the massacre, Mu Hwi felt that Mount Hua was not so weak as to allow lowlifes like them to push them around. It was clear that someone influential was backing these thugs. Mu Hwi didn't know who, but he wasn't concerned with that. His focus shifted to how this situation would be a valuable experience for the younger disciples. Meanwhile, the thug in the green robe seemed to be fixated on Mu Hua's chest, his gaze unwavering as she continued to argue with his companion. Without warning, Mu Hwi drew his sword and pointed it at the thug's eyes, asking where he thought he was looking. This caught the thug off guard, and Mu Hwa was startled by the sudden tension. Mu Hwi explained that he had known from the beginning that the thug was the one who had bumped into her, and he had been waiting to see how the situation would unfold. He had seen the thug's arrogance and was now certain that the thug had crossed the line. He warned them that they had just started a fight with the Mount Hua Sect. Mu Hwi conveyed an understanding of how the Jianghu underworld perceived the Mount Hua Sect. The thug's mind raced in response. It was clear that their origins had been uncovered. A silent curse formed in his thoughts as he struggled to comprehend how this realization had come about. Regardless of the method, action was necessary. With urgency, he acknowledged the mistake and sought to rectify it, offering an apology, but Mu Hwi rejected the apology, unwilling to accept anything from such scum. With a cold, commanding tone, he told them to leave immediately if they didn't want to risk one of them losing an eye. The thugs, fearing that Mu Hwi would follow through with his threat, fled in haste. Mu Hwa, still rattled, apologized to Mu Hwi, but he reassured her, telling her that the thug was in the wrong, not her. Mu Chiol remarked that those from the underworld must be far worse than they had imagined. Mu Hwi, sensing the tension, suggested that they find an inn and get something to eat first. This idea brought joy to Mu Hwa, whose attention was immediately drawn to the food she spotted. On the other hand, Mu Jin remained deep in thought. Mu Jin reflected on the situation. They had been the ones who had picked the fight, yet he had rushed to tell Mu Hwa to apologize without even realizing that. He had been focused on being careful with their behavior, considering they were representing the Mount Hua Sect. But he had failed to recognize the need to address those who had dared to look down on the sect. As Mu Jin pondered, he realized that Mu Hwi had already understood the situation. His senior was aware of his surroundings at all times and had reacted as though he was used to handling such things. Mu Jin, now steeling himself, thought that he would never allow anyone to look down on Mount Hua Sect again. Meanwhile, Mu Hwi regretted not dealing with the thugs more directly, by simply killing them in that moment, but his focus remained on the task at hand. Soon, they arrived at an inn, seated themselves, and prepared to order. When they were done, a mountain of bowls was piled up on the table. Mu Hwi, looking at the pile of bowls, teased them, wondering if they had been lazing around with their training since it seemed like she was eating less than usual. Mu Hwa, quick to defend herself, assured him that she wasn't slacking off. Mu Chiol chimed in, suggesting that Mu Hwi simply ate more now. Right after, Mu Hwa expressed her frustration. It would have been much easier if the sect leader had been more specific with their mission or goal. His instructions had been too vague, leaving them uncertain about what to do next. Mu Hwi tried to offer some direction. He spoke if anything noteworthy had happened during the day. Mu Hwa, still thinking, racked her brain, trying to recall anything important. Some people had picked a fight with them. They had reserved rooms, and then they had eaten. Her thoughts finally led her to the underworld. It clicked in her mind, and she realized the significance of the encounter. Mu Hwi then clarified their situation. The sect leader had given them his full trust to make their own decisions. He was considering teaching a lesson to those from the underworld, though he stopped short of saying it outright, instead suggesting they deal with them. He turned to his fellow disciples, asking what they wanted to do. That night, the 3 second-generation disciples decided that their first course of action would be to gather information. Mu Hwi, donning a cloak, moved through the night, keeping to the shadows as he witnessed a group of random thugs harassing a young woman.